so it seems like our audience has stabilized a bit, so we'll be ready to start. And all of my panelists are actually on screen. So that's great. Welcome everyone to this seminar on non-traditional security in Asia. And thank you very much for joining us today. I know that there's quite a bit of events and webinars being organized, and definitely Zoom fatigue has been hitting us hard. But still, I'm very excited to be chairing this session. This is a webinar organized by the Asia Pacific team of the Defense and Security Foresight Group, which is a collaborative network funded by the Mobilizing Insights in Defense and Security program. I'm sorry here, I've been having a bit of problems with my device, so if this happens again, can you hear me all right? All right, good. So if this happens again, I might switch to a different device. Sorry about that. So again, this is organized by a collaborative network under the Mobilizing Insights in Defense and Security program, D&D. My name is Stéphanie Martel. I'm an assistant professor of political studies at Queen's University and one of the co-leads of the Asia Pacific team. And I have the pleasure of chairing our session today. So now that we have settled a bit more firmly into this new normal stage of the pandemic, is that better?
All right, I see nods here. Great, sorry about that, everyone. So my name is Stéphanie Martel. I'm an assistant professor of political studies at Queen's and one of the co-leads of the Asia Pacific team. And I'll be chairing this session. And this session, the rationale basically behind us organizing this session is that now that we've settled a little bit more into the new normal of the pandemic, we have the opportunity to move the focus beyond COVID-19 and to look at other salient issues that are of a similar kind in the sense that they're perhaps not the issues we immediately think of when it comes to discussing security and defense. But these issues are still very much at the forefront of security concerns in this day and age, and particularly in the Asia Pacific, which is an especially good terrain to look into the security implications of what is commonly referred to in the region, but also elsewhere as non-traditional security issues. And that's because security in this region has always been conceived quite broadly in a way that highlights the interrelation between security and development. So non-traditional issues of security are very much, in a sense, a traditional concern in Asia. This doesn't mean, however, that the region is not also experiencing new security challenges. Particularly, we can think about cyber and other issues, which we'll be discussing today, but also due to the very immediate impact of climate change, which is already visible in the everyday in the region quite explicitly and directly, with dire repercussions that, if left unaddressed or if handled wrongly, will only aggravate. And finally, we also know that demographic change is a mega trend that can have massive implications for governance, and especially in security and defense as well, because it's connected with everything else, right? Including climate change, when we think about migration patterns, for example, but also cyber, because the rise of population and changes in demographics also lead to new practices of population control through surveillance technology. So we're going to make space to discuss all of this today, partly because these issues, which are so important, tend to take second place in discussions about security and defense, which tend to be focused on the hard security issues and power dynamics between states. But these different issues that we're going to address today actually deserve quite a bit of attention, and COVID-19 in particular has made that very clear. So I'm very happy to showcase the expertise of these three brilliant researchers that we host today. Each panelist will have 10 minutes to provide a set of remarks on their topic of expertise before we discuss the interconnections between the issues that they discuss. And I will then turn to our audience for a Q&A. So I see we already have a question on the WebEx platform here in the chat. So the recording is mainly focused on the panelists. We can't see guests, and you will have the opportunity to ask your questions in written form using the Q&A function, which is basically a chat for the meeting. And I'm going to be the one making a selection of these questions and conveying them to our panelists later on. All right. So I'm going to start with introducing our first guest, Irene Potranto. Irene Potranto is a PhD candidate in the Department of Political Science at the University of Toronto. She is a senior researcher for the Citizen Lab, which is an interdisciplinary research lab on digital technology and human rights at the Munk School of Global Affairs and Public Policy. She holds a master's degree in political science and Asia-Pacific studies from the University of Toronto. Her research analyzes cybersecurity policy development in the Global South from a human rights perspective, with a focus on Southeast Asia, although Irene is pluralist in the way that she has also worked on similar issues in the context of India and South Africa. So Irene, the floor is yours. So you have 10 minutes for your remarks. Thank you.
Great. Thank you very much, Stephanie, for inviting me, and thank you to the DSF group for hosting this event. Thank you to Kirsty as well. So it's great to be here today. So I will be focusing on the thematic issue of cyber, or the internet, social media, and the like. And to set the stage, I will focus my remarks on the rise of China and digital authoritarianism in Southeast Asia, but certainly the issues that I will bring up today will have relevance for the rest of Asia as well. And Stephanie made a great point about the change in demographics. That's certainly relevant when we talk about cybersecurity. There is generally like a shift in the center of gravity, right? Even though the internet was developed in the West, specifically in the United States. However, I would argue that the internet's future will be determined by the next billion users who will come online from places like Indonesia, Vietnam, the Philippines, India, and the rest of the Global South. So that's a great remark to start with. And we know that Southeast Asia has a great number of population living there, about 10% of the world's population, or 640 million people, with a median age of 29 years old. So it's a pretty sizable youthful population, and certainly a prime age for internet companies or technology companies to market to. For example, TikTok and all of these companies are looking to expand their market share beyond their home countries, whether that's the US or certainly China. They would be looking to a region like Southeast Asia to further expand their business. And it's also one of the most internet addicted regions in the world. People in the Philippines spend 10 hours and 2 minutes of screen time every day, followed by Thailand and Indonesia as the top 5 in the world. But also what's interesting about Southeast Asia is that it's not a purely Chinese or a purely Western market, right? So it's certainly a playing field for both of them. But recently we are seeing that Chinese companies have been increasing their investments into Southeast Asia-based startups. So between 2018 and 2019, China has increased, or Chinese companies have increased their investments in Southeast Asia 8-fold to about $1.78 billion US. And from the perspective of internet governance, which is the area that I'm focusing on in terms of my PhD research, and certainly in my work as well with the Citizen Lab, we know that China has been advocating for the concept of information security. And by information security, it just means that they're as concerned with content security as much as they're concerned with network security. And of course, we know that in China, they have the Great Firewall. We know that China monitors the internet and mandates for Chinese companies or companies operating in China to do the same. And China has advocated for this position, this information security position, in international fora like the UN. For example, in 2011 and again in 2015, China, as well as SCO, Shanghai Cooperation Organization member states, proposed what's called the International Code of Conduct for Information Security, with a narrative in that code of conduct that prizes state sovereignty and territoriality in the digital space. And when we're talking about China's position when it comes to internet governance, as I said, focusing on information security, perhaps sacrificing a little bit of network security, I think that this position would find resonance in countries in Southeast Asia. And we can talk a little bit more about that later, particularly given the recent developments in places like Myanmar and Cambodia. From my perspective, I think of particular concern here when it comes to developments in Southeast Asia with regard to cyber or the internet is the sale of dual-use tools. So these are tools that have both civilian applications and military applications, for instance, like commercial spyware. So commercial spyware tools, they're used for remote monitoring or remote surveillance, are being sold by Western liberal democracies such as Canada, the US, UK, Germany, and authoritarian governments alike, throughout the world with very little restrictions. An example of that is Finfisher. So Finfisher was developed by Munich-based Gamma International. It's marketed and sold exclusively to law enforcement and intelligence agencies by UK-based Gamma Group. And FinSpy, which is part of the Finfisher toolkit, can capture, keystrokes, can turn on your camera, record, any conversation that you have wherever your device is present, basically, and then send them to a command and control server somewhere else, right? So this type of tool has been used to monitor organized crime groups. They are typically purchased by states because of counter-terrorism reasons. However, the Citizen Lab research has documented that they have been used to target political dissidents and rights activists around the world. In 2013, our research on Finfisher in particular found that it has been used in 25 countries around the world, including in Brunei, Indonesia, Singapore, and Vietnam. And of course, commercial spyware in and of itself is not necessarily a bad thing. Obviously, states need tools these days to fight transnational crimes such as organized crime and terrorism. However, when used in settings with weak democratic institutions or weak rule of law, obviously the use of these type of tools without transparency or accountability will be very problematic. And then what we are seeing in Southeast Asia is that really commercial spyware like Finfisher or Hacking Team or NSA groups as Pegasus, they are really now part of the menu in any authoritarian government toolkit, right? Part of like a menu of authoritarian practices or innovation, to use the term by Glassius or Morgan Besser or Curato. And so in addition to commercial spyware, now authoritarian governments can use network shutdowns or internet shutdowns, as we've seen in Myanmar. They can propose a single gateway, which means that all traffic domestically will be routed to one network to the global internet to facilitate control, which is something that Cambodia has proposed. We are also seeing network disinformation online using bots and trolls, as we've seen in the Philippines during the Duterte campaign. We're seeing broad cybersecurity laws with overly broad and vague definitions of what constitutes as cybercrime or cybersecurity being proposed in different countries in Southeast Asia, as well as the filtering of content, right, that are considered objectionable or negative content in different jurisdictions. And then finally, I think these trends are all part of what Freedom House has noted as rise of digital authoritarianism worldwide. Sorry, that's my cat. We are seeing that countries are declining in freedom rankings worldwide, including in places like Cambodia and the Philippines. And then finally, I think COVID-19 is also is a concern, because now we're seeing countries around the world launching digital apps for contact tracing, for example, without safeguarding privacy and security. Some of these apps even keep track of your location and then secure this information in, as I said, in not a secure way or the most secure way possible, therefore contributing to human rights concerns as well. So I will end my remarks there, and sorry again for my cat.
No worries at all. Kids and pets are very welcome to appear on screen if it happens, just by the way. Thank you, Irene. And also thank you for the concision of your remarks. So that leaves plenty of things to discuss later on as well. So our next panelist is Yvonne Sioux. She is an assistant professor in interdisciplinary refugee and diaspora studies in the Department of Equity Studies at York University. She is a member of the Center for Refugee Studies and the York Center for Asian Research as well. Dr. Sioux's work focuses on forced migration, climate change-induced displacement, humanitarian assistance, and post-disaster recovery, with a particular focus on the Philippines, where she did extensive field research on the post-disaster recovery in the aftermath of Typhoon Haiyan. She holds a PhD in political science and international development from the University of Guelph. Her current research projects look at the impact of COVID-19 on Venezuelan LGBTIQ asylum seekers in Brazil and on disaster-affected households in resettlement areas in Tacloban in the Philippines. She also has an ongoing project on the use of smart cards in the Rohingya refugee camps in Bangladesh. So a wide-ranging geographical scope of your research as well as thematic, Yvonne, which is great, especially since this is a broad Asia-Pacific focused panel. So we'll have plenty of geographical implications across the board to draw from. So the virtual floor is yours.
Thank you, Stephanie, and thank you to the DSFG. I'm very happy to be here to engage in this really important conversation and to share my research on disasters in the Asia Pacific, with my main focus being on the impact of Typhoon Haiyan in the Philippines. So as a region composed of many island states, Asia Pacific is considered the most disaster-prone region in the world, suffering from a range of different extreme disasters. Nearly 45% of the world's natural disasters occur in the region, and more than 75% of those affected by disasters globally live in the region. So that's a pretty huge concentration. And as we know, disasters disrupt the fabric of community life and the undermined capacity of affected households to recover from shocks and to adapt and grow from a disruptive experience, thereby creating the need for the states in the region to devise mechanisms for disaster risk reduction and resilience after disasters. In 2015, member states of the Association of Southeast Asian Nations signified a commitment to institutionalizing resilience through the Declaration on Institutionalizing the Resilience of ASEAN and its Communities and Peoples to Disasters and Climate Change. Adopted by ASEAN leaders in April 2015, this declaration envisioned a disaster-resilient ASEAN community that has mainstreamed disaster risk reduction in all levels of governance. That sounds very nice, and my presentation will kind of go through how that might not be the case. The Philippines has been vulnerable to hazards like typhoons, earthquakes, landslides, and volcanic eruptions, and is ranked the third most disaster-prone country in the world. The country experienced the world's strongest typhoon, Typhoon Haiyan, on November 8, 2013, with a maximum sustained winds of 150 miles per hour. Moreover, the country routinely experiences strong earthquakes, large volcanic eruptions, which contribute to loss of life and severe infrastructural damage. Consequently, such occurrences of disasters in the country have significant impacts on the nation's economic growth and labor market outcomes. The disasters and their often inadequate government and international responses also pose significant threats to human security of the affected populations. Survival, livelihoods, sense of dignity are severely affected after disasters. In the case of Typhoon Haiyan, survival, livelihoods, and dignity remain a challenge 7 years on for the tens of thousands of people who have moved to resettlement sites, who still do not have jobs, and only in the last year receive both reliable water and electricity. Let that sink in. That's pretty tough. Many in the resettlement sites are still living in fear every time during typhoon season because of the strong winds and any possibility of a reoccurrence of a disaster as severe as Typhoon Haiyan. And indeed, a lot of lessons could be learned from Typhoon Haiyan and the national and international response it garnered. But before I dive in, I should give you a bit of context. As mentioned, Typhoon Haiyan was the strongest storm ever recorded at the time. It struck the central islands of the Philippines, mainly Region 8, with the most significant damage and loss of life experienced by Tacloban City, a highly urbanized city and the economic center of the province of Leyte. Region 8 is also the second poorest region of the Philippines. And while there is a lot of money in Tacloban City, there's also many pockets of deep and extreme poverty in the city, particularly among those squatter communities along the coast. The province of Samar was also heavily affected by Typhoon Haiyan, and the communities were already previously known to be impoverished and underdeveloped. The official record for number of deaths was 6,300, but those on the ground say that the real number is much closer to 10,000 to 20,000, with many people being buried in mass graves. A total of 4.4 million people were displaced, and that's more than the number of people displaced by Hurricane Katrina and the Asian tsunami combined. In the end, tens of thousands of people were moved to resettlement sites in the outskirts of the city, approximately 1 hour away from the downtown. These previously underdeveloped fields lacked water, electricity, and road access, so the development was significantly delayed. And when survivors started to move in 3 to 4 years after disaster, after living in temporary housing or really unsanitary and unsafe bunkhouses, many lived in those areas without running water or electricity. As I mentioned earlier, only now, 7 years after the storm, is there reliable water and electricity in those areas, and livelihoods are still a significant problem. And as you can imagine, COVID-19 has only made that much worse. But let's focus on the lessons that can be learned from Typhoon Haiyan in terms of security issues. To begin, like with many other disasters, the issue of human trafficking was significant, but rarely discussed after Typhoon Haiyan. Before Haiyan, Region 8 was already one of the most trafficking-prone regions in the world, in the country. The disaster increased physical, social, and economic insecurity of vulnerable populations, and traffickers preyed on displaced men, women, and children, many of whom were lost, injured, or struggling to cope with the death of family members and the destruction of their homes. When jobs were scarce immediately after the disaster, women and girls from Leyte and Samar were recruited to work as waitresses in karaoke bars in Manila and Cebu, but are then coerced into sex trafficking. This was something I'd heard about firsthand when I was conducting field work. It's extremely difficult to hear about, but that's what happens in these situations when groups take advantage of the vulnerability immediately after disasters. And we've heard this in many disasters previous to this and after. And indeed, the disaster has contributed to forcing people into labor migration internally and abroad to try to provide for their families. While many people I interviewed from my PhD fieldwork in 2016 and 2017 could not put into words that disaster and climate change, using those words, were factors that contributed to their mobility decisions because the level of understanding of disaster-induced and climate change-induced migration was not there. Instead, what they mentioned to me is that Typhoon Haiyan made them scared to live in Tacloban. It made them afraid for their future and are driving them to want to find work and live elsewhere, places that are safe for them and their children. So while they don't use the word that we use in our academic policy circles, we can say that from talking with them, it's clear that disasters and the fear of climate change and their futures does play a role in their mobility. And we know that migration is multi-causal, and of course, displacement as well. And while the impacts of sea level rise and saltwater intrusion isn't as apparent or threatening in the Philippines as it is for small island Pacific states, internal migration is often the start of the process of being displaced by disasters and climate change. Often people move from the rural areas which are experiencing those impacts more severely to urban centers where those aspects are less apparent. For example, the phenomenon is very common in Pacific Islands where rural to urban migration is happening because rural areas are suffering from crop failure due to saltwater intrusion, and this is causing urban areas to be overcrowded. In the case of Typhoon Haiyan, the storm destroyed a significant amount of coconut trees, which was a big source of livelihood for rural communities. With coconut trees taking 15 to 20 years to reach peak production, farmers have lost a significant amount of time, energy, and money. As a result, Tacloban City has actually experienced an increase in migration after Typhoon Haiyan. And this points to what we know, which is a great deal of disaster-induced or climate change-induced migration is internal. So while the hot topic, the sexy term is climate refugees, people displaced across borders as a result of climate change, such as those in small island states that have become uninhabitable due to sea level rise, we also know that the vast majority of people will be displaced internally. And what we've learned from Haiyan is that the government international response was not prepared for the storm at this level. The people on the ground were not properly warned. A scientific debate over the term storm surge led to a great deal of people not evacuating because they did not understand what a storm surge meant. They did not understand that it was a 7-meter tall wave that would wipe out most of Tacloban City. While what they experienced was technically or scientifically called a storm surge, those on the ground would have better preferred words like a big wave or even tsunami, but it was scientifically wrong to label the storm surge with those titles. As such, people did not properly prepare for the severity of the storm due to this type of miscommunication. In terms of international response, many humanitarian organizations were trying to implement foreign or cookie cutter approaches on the ground. There was a lack of local consultation or local hiring, despite many Filipinos being fluent in English. I witnessed large NGOs basically learning as they went when it came to resettlement areas, which led to the issues of lack of water, electricity, and transportation and livelihoods. There were cheaper plots of land that could be purchased, which were much better for the relocation population because they were closer downtown, but I guess they weren't cheaper, they were more expensive plots of land, but NGO chose to go with the larger, cheaper plots of land because they thought that they could build more houses there and help more people, despite local people telling them that that was not a good way to go. Because moving to Tacloba North meant submitting to a lonely and difficult life, which local people knew, but NGOs, I guess, did not choose to see that. And when I was on the ground, I heard many stories of locals feeling that their voices and suggestions were ignored. This came from all levels. Local NGO staff felt that their local knowledge was not valued or that it was pushed aside. And locals who did participate in local consultations said that they felt it was performative and things weren't actually implemented. International aid contributed to growing tensions in the tight-knit communities between the haves and have-nots. And it's hard to say that after Typhoon Haiyan, the community came back together closer, even though that's what humanitarians and NGOs like to see. So in future disasters, the international response needs to involve more locals, and they need to respect and listen to local knowledge. The communities and the homes we lived in for generations to come by locals, not foreign humanitarian consultants. So we need to listen to them as they know what's best for them and what's best for their future. Thank you.
Thank you so much, Yvonne, for this very comprehensive assessment of the human security implications that we don't necessarily look for or anticipate when it comes to the post-disaster situation. So I was especially struck with your discussion about the repercussions on human trafficking patterns, which I personally hadn't thought about at all. And obviously your point about involving local actors and giving them the recognition of expertise is also very well taken. So thank you. We're moving now to our third panelist, Isabelle Côté. She is an associate professor in the Department of Political Science at Memorial University. She's also a core member of the Asia-Pacific team of the Defense and Security Foresight Group. Her research investigates the role of internal population movements on intrastate conflict and contentious politics in East and Southeast Asia. In particular, her work is focused on the violent clashes between ethnically distinct native people and internal migrants, such as the Sons of the Soil conflict. And she has focused as well on authoritarian China and newly democratizing Indonesia as particular cases in her research program. Recently, she has also explored the impacts of political, economic, and ecological resettlement programs in Asia, Europe, and North America. Her work has been published in numerous journals, including, among others, Studies in Conflict and Terrorism and the Canadian Journal of Political Science. She currently serves on the executive boards of the Canadian Council of Southeast Asian Studies and the ISA Political Demography and Geography section. She received her PhD in political science from the University of Toronto, held various guest researchers' positions in China and Indonesia, and she was a postdoctoral fellow at the Royal Netherlands Institute of Southeast Asian and Caribbean Studies. Isabelle, the floor is yours for 10 minutes. Welcome.
Thank you very much. I'll try to be as concise as my fellow panelists. Thank you very much, first of all, for inviting me to discuss non-traditional security issues in Asia. And today I'd like to take this platform to discuss the role of demographic changes. And by that, I mean sudden changes to either the number or the composition of population in a given area and how that affects security issues. So demographic changes, what does that include? Well, it could include things like a rapid aging of population. It could include things like an imbalanced sex ratio, the one-child policy, but also mass migration. And that's the latter that I'll be focusing on mostly today. And in the academic literature, migration security is usually examined from one of two different approaches. So on the one hand, you can think of migration as a threat to the security of the state. And so in that case, then you would examine, for instance, whether a higher number of international migrants or refugees may increase the likelihood or propensity for terrorist attack. A spoiler, they don't. Another way, or another kind of project that you would look from this approach would be to examine the role of migration, how it affects political stability or national cohesion in a state. So again, here migration would be the threat, and the referent object would be state security. If you flip things around, though, another way to look at migration and security is to investigate the various threats of security that are affecting the migrants themselves. So here, then, the object of the referent object would be the migrants themselves, and then you would look at the various threats to their well-being. Could include things like cholera, gangs, or the very actions of the states, right? So here you flip the situation and the state, or you're looking at the various threats that affect the security of migrants. But as Stephanie pointed out a bit earlier, my own work, my own research has fallen somewhere in between those two broad approaches. And instead, I've spent the last 10 years or so examining what's been called Sons of the Soils conflicts, so the violent clashes that occur between recently relocated internal migrants and local people. So some people in the past have been a bit surprised to think of internal migrants as being something that should be integrated into security studies. Two big arguments as why this should be the case. One is number alone. The global number of internal migrants around the world greatly surpassed that of international migrants. And recent estimates, for instance, have put the number of internal migrants around the world at 763 million people, as opposed to 253 million international migrants. So there are many of them. But you shouldn't just worry or care or focus on them because there are many of them. You should do that because in large multinational states, for instance, you may think of India, Indonesia, China. Well, in those big states, the host and migrants population may have never really been in contact prior to the relocation, and they may also come from very different linguistic, religious, ethnic backgrounds. And this has, on occasion, been a source of not only tension, but also violence. And my own work, and what I would like to illustrate a little bit, this dynamic is most of my work has been on China and Indonesia. So one such example of violent clashes between local people and internal migrants have taken place in Xinjiang in China in July of 2009. When Uyghur populations, the local ethnic minority, a Turkic-speaking, Muslim practicing minority, have clashed violently with the Han Chinese migrants. And while the Chinese government was very quick to blame the three forces of separatism, extremism, and terrorism, another explanation have gradually come to the forefront, which was that the ever-increasing presence of Han Chinese migrants, Han Chinese settler in the region, may have been playing a role in the recent surge in violence in Xinjiang. And drastic changes to the demographic population of the region, or in Xinjiang, there really was a tremendous population change since the Xinjiang Uyghur Autonomous Region was created in 1955. So at the time, the Uyghurs were the largest ethnic group in the region. It represented approximately 75% of population. But over the following 3 decades, over 3 million Han Chinese have relocated, mostly from the coast, to Xinjiang, either as part of state-organized migration program or as part of voluntary migration. And these very large inflows of Han migrants have affected the demographic balance locally. So in just over 50 years then, the Han Chinese, which used initially to represent approximately 6% of the population, grew to represent approximately 40% of population. So this is a massive change in overall a fairly short amount of time. And while the Uyghurs are still technically the majority group, as they represent still 46% of population, This has been questioned by a number of scholars because the Chinese population census for provincial units do not account for unofficial migrants, so migrants who have not changed their hukou, nor does it account for military members and military personnel. So truly then the actual numbers of Han Chinese in the regions are slightly questioned. So those demographic changes are not enough on their own to result in violence and ethnic conflict. After all, we can think, or we know how ubiquitous internal migration is. Most of us are probably internal migrants in our own country. But what my work has shown is that what seems to be, what is especially contentious is the relocation of people who belong to the dominant ethnic group in the country. So in this case here, Han Chinese relocated to Xinjiang rather than being Hui Chinese or Tibetans, for instance. Because the migrants belonging to a dominant ethnic group have they have close connection to the states, but they also have a close connection or better access to the political and economic levers in the country. So this puts them in a very unique position where both a demographic minority locally and therefore possibly vulnerable, but being part of a dominant ethnic group nationally or at the states level also gives them a power that other groups do not have. What I wanted to spend the next 3 or 4 minutes that I have with you here is to highlight how this is not something of the past. So the events in Xinjiang took place in 2009. Some of you may think, well, this is old news. Well, actually, as we've seen with COVID, this is far from being old news. Population movements, be they international or domestic or statewide, have been blamed for spreading the virus, as we know. And in an effort to better protect this health security of its population, several governments have famously implemented international travel bans, as well as various restrictions on domestic mobility, including restriction on interprovincial migration and lockdowns. And this is, of course, nothing unique to Asia. As I'm sure many of you know, those of you residing in Canada, the government of Newfoundland and Labrador, where I'm currently living, has since the summer of 2020 implemented or has made it necessary for non-residents to obtain a permit to visit the province. So those regulations or those restrictions are not limited to Asia in any sense. But for the purpose of this presentation, I'll focus on the repercussions in the region. So mobility restrictions have come with a heavy cost for migrants and undocumented workers in Asia, not only because they face a higher risk of infection of COVID, they have limited access to healthcare, which has put them in a very, very difficult conundrum to die from hunger or to die from the virus. Another important impact has been the increase in anti-migrant prejudice and stigma that has come with COVID due to the fear of COVID transmission. And recent studies have shown that this kind of discrimination has applied to people who are seen as foreign, as well as to return migrants. So people who are local, but who temporarily have decided to relocate for usually economic reasons. So this shows here that it's not so much the lack of roots that's considered an issue, but the very act of moving is seen as problematic. Violent protests have emerged in India, among other places, as migrant workers have asked for an end to lockdowns. And elsewhere in Asia, COVID-19 has also exacerbated interstate conflict as competing sides have looked to gain strategic advantage from the health crisis. And while some rebel groups have increased their legitimacy by providing health services to the population, several Asian governments have also simultaneously strengthened their grasp over the population, imposing new border controls, as well as increasing surveillance through mobile network. So as my presentation hopefully showed, internal migration dynamics, in particular demographic changes, do matter for security issues in China and Asia as a whole. And they matter because they're interrelated. So it's difficult to just look at security of the migrants You should also, migration also showed the importance of looking at human security, state security, and international security. There are also, and while Sons of the Soil's conflict may be highly localized in certain prefectures or villages, we can see how they may affect, the impact may be felt beyond the states and beyond those regions, as we've seen in the case of Kazakhstan and Mongolia, for instance, two countries that are bordering with minority regions in China. So these questions all warrant serious attention as Sons of the Soil's conflict show no signs of abating or going anywhere. And if anything, really, revolutionary changes in transportation and telecommunication both underscore the need for more research on migration conflict nexus. And it also shows that Sons of the Soil's conflict will not become a relic of the past, but rather a continued security threat across the globe. And COVID-19 has made this painfully clear. So thank you very much for your attention. I look forward to your question.
Thank you very much, Isabel. I've never thought of myself as an internal migrant before, I must admit, but I am. So it's an interesting kind of addition or implication of your presentation. Definitely not the most important one, though. So thank you all, and also for sticking to time constraints. So I'm going to leave the audience some time to ponder their questions, and I'm going to help with that by using this as an opportunity for a couple of follow-ups with you. And this is because I'm especially struck by the many parallels that can be drawn across your areas of expertise and across your cases as well. So I'm going to start with Isabel, because, you know, we know that there has been increasing interest and concerns over the security implications of China's use of technology and surveillance. And you mentioned that kind of briefly, right? But it's still very interesting that, you know, most of the initial conversation about, you know, China's surveillance policies was really focused on how China would surveil its own citizens. You know, we've heard a lot in the media about, you know, the social credit system, as you mentioned, the firewall, or I think Irene may have suggested that. Also the facial recognition, you know, stories about, you know, washrooms having facial recognition device, you know, in exchange for toilet paper and stuff. But most of the recent discussions that we've been hearing, you know, when it comes to these issues, they've really been focusing on China's use of technology on the global stage, right? So we have concerns about the security implications of 5G technology and Huawei, of course, but also cyber attacks, etc. But we know, as you mentioned as well, that China is also increasingly using technology for surveillance purposes, particularly in Xinjiang. So I was wondering if you could tell us a bit more about the specific ways that the Chinese government is using such surveillance technology towards the Uyghur population specifically, and the extent to which it is distinct from maybe other patterns of surveillance that we see across China.
Thanks, Stephanie, for giving me a chance to elaborate a little bit more on the growing surveillance state in Xinjiang. And as I'm sure many of you are aware, there have been numerous media reports, NGO reports, that have shown how Xinjiang has become a bit of a laboratory of some sorts for the Chinese government to test and deploy various technology of population control. There's been, for instance, a creation of a mass surveillance and monitoring platform. So some of you may know it as the Integrated Joint Operation Platform. There's been also a creation of single apps that have been developed by the Chinese states to collect personal data to determine, and in the case of Xinjiang, a lot of that information was collected in an effort to determine whether these people should be sent to re-education camps. So there was a clear objective behind the collection of that information. Needless to say, that goes also in addition to a more traditional or low-tech means of population controls, like, you know, various checkpoints in the autonomous region, surveillance camera, et cetera, et cetera. One aspect that has perhaps received a little bit less attention is that in order to deploy all this technology, you also need the manpower, right? You need the actual labor to operate it. And so in the last few years, there's been a massive, there have been several massive campaigns to recruit people, again, mostly migrants, to be able to staff and operate and become police officers in province, along with other jobs. And this has led to James labeling Xinjiang as being the most or one of the most heavily policed regions in the world. So this is not lightly put. And just one last point on your question, Stephanie. What has become also clear is that in a number of occasions, the Chinese government has been testing means in Xinjiang and then have been able to try them in other provinces, for instance, in Yunnan and in Shandong province. So provinces where also live large number of minority populations. So it seems to become clearer and clearer that while everyone in China is being affected in one way or another by those new technology, that this seems to be especially the case for minority population. And so this is something that we'll have to keep an eye on as the situation in Qinghai, for instance, the Tibetan province, the situation in Inner Mongolia, and the situation in Yunnan have seemed to kind of move slowly in the direction of Xinjiang. So this leaves with important cause for concern.
Thank you, Isabel. So there are already questions coming in that I'm going to keep for later because I want to move to Irene. But just to give you a heads up, Isabel, there is interest among our audience to know if you have any thoughts about the semantics of calling the situation in Xinjiang a genocide, particularly in the Canadian context. So just wanted to give you a heads up that this might be coming your way later on. But moving to Irene, just a moment for now. So Irene, talking about another kind of event in Southeast Asia that's attracting a lot of attention, and I'm talking about the coup in Myanmar, obviously. So we know that the junta has adopted new cybersecurity laws to allow it to ban content, restrict internet access, and intercept data to repress civil disobedience movements that are really taking on a lot of importance right now, and to clamp down on protesters. Does this go, and I know that you have done research on ASEAN specifically, the Association of Southeast Asian Nations, and how they're developing their own norms, basically, or localizing some global norms on cyber. Is what's going on in Myanmar entirely in line with what we should expect from this group of countries that is commonly branded, as you know, as a club of dictators? And that lacks nuance a little bit, but still. Or can we expect some form of social pressure or quiet diplomacy from ASEAN? And we know that this is already coming. We've seen some statements by the organization that are may fall short of what Western actors in particular are expecting in terms of strong statements condemning the coup, but are still kind of strong, statements from the organization still. So should we expect that the cyber dimension gets addressed in ASEAN's position on the coup, or is this something that we expect will just be sidelined just because of ASEAN's own kind of restrictive understandings, if I may call it this way, of how to implement cyber norms, particularly when it comes to policing, the use of the internet among dissidents in particular. So I don't know if you have thoughts on that.
Mm-hmm. Yeah, thank you. I mean, this is a really great question. And in the original question that you sent me in the email, you asked, should we continue to lower our expectations? And when I read that, I was like, well, we should lower expectations, but really, can it be any lower when it comes to the protection of human rights in Southeast Asia, whether that's through ASEAN, the ASEAN framework, or on a country-to-country basis, right? So I mean, I have a very pessimistic view, unfortunately, but I'm sure it's not surprising with regard to the turn of events and what it will and how it will look like in the future. Because as I mentioned, I mean, in Southeast Asia, you have a whole spectrum of governments who have implemented various strategies to essentially dampen the political impact of the internet, right? And so countries like Myanmar and Cambodia, they really have an array of options to choose from, right? Whether that's the more light touch type of regulation, which Singapore and Malaysia have been known for, right? Gary Rodan has been writing about this since, like, I don't know, 1998, to the Philippines, which, they don't censor the internet, but it is one of the, I think it's a top 5 most dangerous place in the world for journalists, right? And then obviously you have Vietnam and Indonesia, which, they do censor the internet. We found Finfisher and other commercial spyware being used there. And they've even shut down the internet, right? Indonesia shut down the internet in the wake of protest in Papua. So I think given recent trends, and not just recent, as I said, Singapore has been doing this for ages, even in the pre-internet era, using libel and defamation, using the legal route basically to silence dissidents. I don't have high hopes, unfortunately, with regard to what the rules of the road for cyberspace would look like in Southeast Asia, because, even though ASEAN has endorsed in principle the cyber norms that were agreed upon at the UN back in, I believe, 2015, I think in practice, we are seeing that they are not abiding by those norms at all. And I mean, the same could be said of the Five Eyes countries, right? The US, UK, Australia, New Zealand, and Canada, we engage in surveillance as well, as much as we say that we care about human rights, and Canadian companies are implicated as well. So I think this is a really a tricky situation, and I don't know if it would be able to get an agreement on how to move forward on this, whether that's on a regional level or international level.
Thanks very much, Irene, for these insights. I want to move to Yvonne, and then I'm going to bring in some questions from the audience. So, as you mentioned, Yvonne, and you explained that very powerfully, the Asia Pacific is already severely impacted by climate change, and this is very direct, very observable. There has been also marked surge in the intensity and number of catastrophic events in the region, unless I'm mistaken, over recent years. So we can think about what recently happened in the Philippines in November 2020. So in the middle of a global pandemic, the Philippines was hit by not one, but 2 typhoons under 2 weeks. So this makes it like the security implications of this on human security in particular is quite direct, quite clear. But we know that also beyond issues that relate to the physical kind of damage on villages and towns and infrastructure, but also on lives, we also, as you mentioned, there are a lot of further implications on migration patterns. And I want to spend a bit more time talking about the implication on migration here, partly because there is such a direct connection with what Isabel has discussed. So we know that there are security implications, listening to Isabel, when it comes to internal migration, not only for the human security of the people displaced, which Yvonne, you talked about, particularly when you mentioned human trafficking implications, but also this, as Isabel mentions, may create conflicts between those who leave or relocate and their host communities. So I wonder if you have seen similar patterns than those highlighted by Isabel in the Philippines case, and if you're able to give us some information on lessons learned when it comes to the implications on intracommunal tensions, on xenophobia, and how to make sure that this doesn't lead to new areas of conflict and new violence. Any thoughts on that?
Yeah, thank you so much, Stephanie, for bringing us together, and then me hearing Isabel's research, because as she was talking, it sparked a lot of things that I reflect back on the field that I didn't make the connections, right? So hearing Isabel's framework really did that for me. So in the sense of Typhoon Haiyan, because it was the local hub of assistance, because it had an airport, So a lot of aid actually went to Tacloban. Of course, it was really heavily hit, but a lot of the rural areas, like I mentioned, the coconut farmers, they've just lost all of their livelihood, like generations of, planting, etc., plants, all of that devastated. While some of the rural areas were more in need, because Tacloban City was the easiest to reach, and because the Philippines is made of so many islands and it's difficult to get to, there was a huge bias towards Tacloban. So as a result, many people did migrate internally to Tacloban just to receive aid. And hence the tension, hence the conflict. Because here you are heavily affected, and then these people are not from your community, yet they've come. And it's really difficult because that they also need help. But the way that international aid has structured the criteria for aid makes it so it's a lot more zero sum. Right? So if there are internal migrants coming in and stealing, quote unquote, my aid from my community, that's not good. And there's where a lot of conflict resides. And there's a lot of ratting each other out. Like it was very common. And we don't talk about this because it makes disaster affected communities and people look very petty or it does not make them look good, but it's also a reality. Right? Like if I'm told that there's only X amount of houses, X amount of food, and I'm seeing people who are richer than me or who have more resources or who are not from this community get that assistance, right? I'm incentivized to go and tell Red Cross and tell Oxfam that these people shouldn't get the aid. And that's where the community kind of falls apart. And it leads back to some of the work I've done on bayanihan, which is the Filipino term for mutual aid, for community support, very similar to the caremongering that we've seen in Canada as a result of COVID-19. This idea that everybody comes together and we're all this very happy community, getting groceries, just helping each other out all the time. But as we've even seen in Canada, that only lasts for a very short amount of time before people have to go back to their lives or before social tensions come up and the previous cleavages, come back, or they're even worse. They come back with a vengeance almost sometimes. So in this case, in the Philippines, that definitely happened. In my research and in talking to people, a lot of them talked more about negativity with neighbors and as a result of humanitarian aid than they did of good things that came. And something else that's also really interesting is that many of them actually praise assistance from southern countries, right, or countries in the area. So Chuchi, which is a Taiwanese Buddhist organization, came out as one of the organizations that was really well praised because they didn't really have criteria for getting aid, right? If you lived in this community, you had X amount of kids, I'm not going to ask you how heavily damaged your house was, right? I'm not going to ask you what your income previous to the disaster was, right? You're clearly in need of help. So here's the money, here's the food. And people locally actually appreciated that so much more, as opposed to thinking that they have to either lie, right? Because sometimes you maybe had a good job or you may have a nice house, but it's ruined. So are you going to go in and just tell them you're poorer than you actually are? And that also leads to conflict. So I've heard lots of people praising Korea and China because they just focus on infrastructure, right? So like, oh, those roads are so nice. The Koreans did such a great job building those roads. Or that church is so nice. The Chinese built that church. And it's a different form of aid that does not lead to so much conflict. So that's an interesting discussion that's going to emerge as displacement gets increased, as these tensions get increased, of Southern-led humanitarian assistance and Southern-led response. Because I think those ones do try their best to take consideration of the locals, or at least locals feel like because it's inter-Asian countries helping each other, there is more of a cultural understanding than if there were just a foreign country coming in and implementing something. So that's been something really interesting that I've noticed in the work.
I like how you draw a parallel with the Canadian context in COVID-19. I'm going to draw another, right? And that includes Canada, but it's also the global level. These zero-sum, dynamics in situations of disaster are now very apparent in the global discourses around, COVID-19 and the vaccines in particular, right? So we all started this by saying, oh, we're all in it together. This is such a way that we recognize our interdependence and the fact that we're very much a global community, all in the same boat. And then the sooner whenever we get into, asking about where vaccines are going, then immediately these zero-sum dynamics and inequalities get very, very salient. So I guess, in whatever the kind of crisis that we're faced in, we always see these kind of dynamics creeping in at some point, right? All right, thank you so much. So I'm going to draw from our audience now, and I'm going to start with Isabel with this very tricky question that I hope you're comfortable handling, which is about, again, the semantic politics around calling the situation in Xinjiang a genocide. So as we know, there was a unanimous position in Ottawa calling the situation in Xinjiang a genocide, although the liberals obviously abstained from that. So I wonder if you can enlighten us and give us a glimpse of your own position when it comes to that question, if only to redirect the question in a way that you see fit. But I would love to hear you too.
Sure. So genocides are usually defined as being the mass targeted killings of a specific population. So if you think about, the general, or the main examples that come to our mind about genocides, we usually think about the Holocaust, Rwanda, Srebrenica. So we have, images in our mind of mass graves, and we have this kind of, this is what we think about when we think about this. So is that the case in Xinjiang? Yes and no, right? So there is definitely a targeted killing, or there's definitely a targeted set of policies in Xinjiang. But by focusing on killings, we miss something, which is the demographic changes again. And so I'll repeat myself here, is that yes, there may be some the risk of Uyghurs are more likely to be arrested. They're more likely to be imprisoned. They're more likely to be killed in Xinjiang than other groups. However, there are also other policies happening right now that affect the population, that affect Xinjiang, and some of them are demographic policies, and some of them are cultural policies. So if I can elaborate a little bit on that, I'll hopefully provide some more context. But if you want to decrease a group's population, you can of course kill them, but you can also do campaigns of mass sterilization. You can also do campaigns of abortion, like massive abortion for that particular group, and we know that this is also happening in Xinjiang. You can also try to dilute that population locally by campaigns of mass migration. So if your goal is not so much to decrease the absolute number of Uyghurs, but to dilute them locally so that they have less power and there's less reasons truly to implement autonomous policies, well, you can encourage mass migration campaigns to Xinjiang. And these are happening, as we know. So this is things that have been recorded and that have been shown that's been happening. But those are aspects or examples of demographic genocides. We also know that what has been happening has been campaigns to, for instance, destroy various mosques in the region, destroy the various neighborhoods that were largely inhabited by the Uyghur population. So old Kashgar has been razed. And so all of that are examples of cultural genocide as well, which has a longer term or a longer duration, right? So this is more perhaps a goal, an absolute goal in the longer term to decrease the population. But this is something that is less drastic or easily observable as perhaps what we've seen in Rwanda or Srebrenica. So is it an example? There's certainly some of the same goals, but it would be a mistake to just think of it as the targeted killings of Uyghurs, because it's a more, what seems to be happening in Xinjiang has been more broader and more different, going in different directions at once, all the while with the goal of diluting the power of that population. Thank you for your question.
Thanks, Isabel. And that question came from network lead Besma Momani at the University of Waterloo, by the way. So what I hear from your comments is that basically, you know, and this is pretty much, I think, you know, how I would approach this question as well, in the sense that, you know, it's not a matter of assessing whether things going on in Xinjiang are especially tragic and horrible. We know this, right? But the key word here is this, does this count as a genocide? You know, when it comes to the very particularistic, very bounded definition in international law of what a genocide actually counts as and what it is, right? As a specific, very specific, politically charged term. And what I couldn't avoid thinking when I was witnessing, you know, all of these debates being played out in Canada is the fact that, you know, the fact that we have such a specific definition of genocide is also a Canadian responsibility, right? Canada had a role to play in defining this definition very narrowly, partly because, and this is not the first debate that we've been having around genocide in this country, because it didn't want to be faulted for being itself responsible for a genocide and the genocide of Indigenous peoples in Canada. So it seems very odd to me, and I don't know if other panelists have views on this, how the previous debate on the semantics of the genocide were conveniently sidelined, at least in what I've seen in terms of commentary on the situation in Xinjiang. And obviously, you know, there are reasons for that, because we know that China has been very strategic in making claims, you know, and making false moral equivalencies, perhaps, is the view of at least the Liberal government when it comes to you know, throwing that very political charged term around. But this was especially striking to me. And so I appreciate you making that kind of distinction between the legal, very precise definition of what is a genocide and just what is going on in Xinjiang more generally, which is definitely condemnable, I think. So I don't know if Yvonne or Irene have additional thoughts on that. But I'm going to move, if not to our second question from an audience member who mentions that, who asks all of you, basically, so it really depends on who wants to take this on, whether we can see the pandemic, the COVID-19 pandemic, obviously, as a missed opportunity or as something that kind of derailed the attention that we should have paid to the issues that you mentioned, or alternatively, can we see the global pandemic as further a stronger argument for there to be a harder stance on some of the issues that you mentioned, particularly when it comes to human rights and surveillance, as a result of policies that were implemented to deal with the pandemic in some of the countries that you've looked at. So is this a missed opportunity? Did it derail attention away from the issues that you mentioned? Or does the pandemic actually highlight a further need to look into these issues and how they relate between them, basically? So I don't know if there's a volunteer to tackle that very interesting broad question that I see all of you being able to answer that question potentially with the folks on your issues. Are we, Irene? I see some beginning of a hesitation. Good.
Sure, I'm happy to take a crack. I mean, this is a really a great question. You know, is it a missed opportunity, or has it highlighted the need for a harder stance? I mean, to me, I think from the perspective of cyber issues, internet governance issues, I think it has highlighted the need. So to give one example, the concept of privacy, right? The right to privacy is one of our fundamental human rights. I think for a long time, I heard a lot of pushback, or at least uncertainty when it comes to the right to privacy and how it should be tackled in a region like Southeast Asia, right? For a lot of countries, for a lot of languages in Southeast Asia, there is no such term in our local languages or native languages for privacy. So I think for a lot of not just those in civil society, but also in the business community, and of course in governments, they tend to think, well, privacy is a foreign concept. It doesn't apply here because we're a collective culture, etc. And I think the pandemic, and as I mentioned earlier, the use of digital apps, for instance, for contact tracing, at least to begin with, and we know that it's going to be used for other purposes as well, like immunity passports and for other purposes that governments have been using them. Indonesia, for example, updated the contact tracing app to now also include a facial recognition function to measure the user's temperature and whether the user is wearing a mask or not before entering into a public space. So there is mission creep here, right? And the pandemic has facilitated that. These apps were not in existence before the pandemic, and now they're here, and the functionalities of these apps keep increasing. We know in Singapore, even though the government resisted for a long time sharing the data gleaned from the Trace Together app, I think more recently they said they're going to share the information with law enforcement, right? And I think that is just one small example, I think, of how the pandemic has highlighted that right to privacy is a human right, despite cultural relativists, wanting to say otherwise, that it's a Western construct. And I think we are only beginning to see the consequences of the pandemic on our right to privacy. And I think these are debates that will only going to continue, not just regionally, but globally as well.
Thanks, Irene. Very interesting point. So moving to Yvonne, perhaps. I don't know if you have additional thoughts that you want to share.
Yes. So one of the projects I'm working on is to look at the impact of COVID-19 on the resettlement communities, because I heard from local people that, they feel further isolated, right? I mean, it's kind of a huge "I told you so" by the local community to say that we've urged to move closer, to not have these resettlement sites be so far away, to be so rural, to be in places with, either no road access or very limited road access. And of course, they couldn't predict that a pandemic would come, but it's almost like all of their concerns have just been validated and, of course, exacerbated by the pandemic. Because if they felt lonely and isolated before, they feel further alone and isolated now. And imagine, it is an hour away by public transport. And if public transport then became a dangerous thing, they can't walk, or they can try to bicycle, but that's even, they're just really made it much more challenging for people to have a livelihood, because in these rural areas, or these areas that they have the resettlement sites, there really aren't sources of livelihood. They've always said it to be like, we build the houses first and the livelihoods will come later. And for local people, they know that that's not how it works. And they know that, for them, their lives are every single day. Right. Whereas when you talk about with the humanitarian consultants, are like in year 1, year 2, year 3, and there's just different scales. And I think one thing the pandemic has highlighted is, again, how important it is to listen to local people, to listen to their concerns and to validate them, because again, they couldn't see it coming, but they just felt that being this far away was just not good for them. And here we are seeing it play out, and they're also far from hospitals. So again, there's all these different concerns that are exacerbated because they're so isolated.
Isabel, any additional thoughts on that you want to pass? All right, so I'm going to throw in a last, unless there's something coming up from the audience here, but maybe a last kind of broad question to you all. And I'm going to do this by using the proverbial Canadian angle, which I know that our audience might be really interested in. So you've already drawn some interesting parallels with Canada, but still, more specifically, so we know, and listening to you has helped with that, obviously, that non-traditional security issues are not just a low-hanging fruit of security cooperation or a set of soft issues, but they're a very pressing set of concerns for states and other actors, particularly in the Asia Pacific. And all of your presentations kind of outline that very well. So as Canada is looking for ways to step up its engagement of the Asia Pacific region, make a meaningful contribution to peace and security, what are some of the things that Canada can do when it comes to engaging in forms of cooperation with its partners in the region, or with like-minded states that are involved as well in this region when it comes to the issues that you have discussed? And are there things that Canada in turn should be aware of mindful of when it comes to developing cooperation with regional partners on the issues that you've looked at? So I don't know if by a show of hands, I can have a volunteer to start with that. Perhaps we could start with you, Isabel, if that's okay. You need a bit more time. Irene, going back to you, are you up for that?
Yeah, sure. I mean, this is a great question. Thank you, Stephanie. I think I'm just going to reuse your terminology here about like low-hanging fruits. I think when it comes to cybersecurity and you know, internet and human rights issues, I think there are lots of low-hanging fruits for Canada to engage with when it comes to countries in Asia, or particularly Southeast Asia. I think capacity building is definitely one, because a lot of these developing countries certainly do not have the capacity yet to protect themselves. And so I think that is something that Canada, along with like-minded countries like maybe the US again, in the post-Trump era, with the Netherlands, the UK, France, and others, that's something that they together can work on. And then I think one issue I think would be the issue of gender, right? I think realizing that cybersecurity issues, whether that's surveillance or whether that's targeted attacks against civil society, these are not experienced by, you know, by the population in a similar manner. Like different communities are impacted differently. And I think Yvonne and Isabel's presentations have really spoken to that. Migrant communities are affected differently. People who live and work in rural areas are affected differently. There is a digital divide issue. And I know that Canada has a feminist foreign policy. And so I think that is something that Canada should definitely lean on when it comes to providing capacity building and other assistance to countries in the region.
Thanks, Irene. Can we move to Yvonne next? So are there things that Canada can do when it comes to dealing with you know, the implications of disasters and climate change, but also internal migration, perhaps, when it comes to cooperation with local partners or regional partners? Or alternatively, is there something that Canada should be especially aware or perhaps even concerned with when it comes to engaging in these schemes?
Yeah, I think that we could actually just start to learn from the Asian countries that are leading some of the response, right? I was really fascinated that a lot of the praises went to those countries, because I knew that the US, Canada, Australia, other countries had also contributed large amounts. But it's because when they went about distributing the aid, they didn't take the cultural context, they didn't implement local knowledge. Right. And the idea is like people, well, Canadians might like this very structured, like you must make less than this amount of money, your house must be totally damaged, you must have 3+ kids. Like we have all these, I guess, criterion factors and science behind how we distribute aid, when really, you know, when you're on the ground, you just need help, especially perhaps in the first month, right? Like rich, poor, like a lot of people are similarly devastated, and they need very simple things like food and shelter that, you know, don't need to discriminate or be eliminated and included or excluded based on this criteria. So, but I know that, you know, NGOs will go back and say, but we're accountable to Canadian taxpayers. So it's a complicated dance. But I think from what I've seen on the ground, like local people really appreciated that the Asian countries came in and said, you know, here's the amount of aid, take it for this amount of time, right? And they didn't bother with what they could save or include or exclude among different populations. Also, like there is a lot of self-regulations. If you're a really rich person and you're lining up, people know you're a really rich person, right? So there's already that shame that will eliminate those types of people. So I think Canada can learn from the Asian countries and other Southern countries in terms of how they approach their humanitarianism. And then I also just want to draw attention to what you had mentioned in terms of the Canadian comparison of what we're experiencing and how everybody's saying we're all in it together. And I think what we can learn from the Philippines and that response and response to disasters in general is that we aren't all in it together, and that it's only going to be very temporary. So we do really need to hold our governments accountable and not let those buzzwords and those buzz phrases, which we've heard so many times, and it is effective. It makes us feel really good to feel that we're all in it together. Our neighbor's going to help us. But at the end of the day, Canadians also need to have their human security protected, right? Their survival, their livelihood, their sense of dignity. So I think we need to not let the discourse on community help in these warm fuzzy things distract us from asking the government to do the hard work of providing for especially the vulnerable groups that we have here in Canada.
Thanks, Yvonne. And one of the implications that I draw from listening to you as well is that we have to think about areas of cooperation between Canada and local or regional actors exclusively in terms of state to state, right? Rodrigo Duterte wasn't particularly brilliant in the way that he responded to disasters and the global pandemic over the last year in particular, and he was severely criticized domestically for that response. So that doesn't mean, though, that there is not room for identifying actual local actors who do have the expertise and are doing the work when it comes to thinking about what can help. So thank you for that. Moving to Isabel last, in case you have anything to add, Isabel.
Sure. Thank you for giving me a few more seconds to gather my thoughts. Yes, so in terms of other lessons to be learned from Asia and Asian countries, most definitely. If we look at Vietnam, at Taiwan and Singapore, those are countries that have done surprisingly well in terms of dealing, making sure that the pandemic was, all things considered, did not spread as much as it could have. And some of that came from their knowledge from the SARS crisis. I was myself in Hong Kong 2002, 2003 when SARS happened. Those are all countries that have been affected by SARS and have learned about it. So there's definitely the benefit of local knowledge, experience. So you ask a Canadian how to prevent or how to protect yourself in terms, if there's a snowstorm, but, in terms of global pandemics or typhoon prevention, there are certain countries that have more of an experience dealing with that. The quick points I wanted to add also is that what also seems to be coming out is the importance of narrative and how those narratives have real implication. Here I'm thinking about the narrative of belonging, who has the right to assistance, to help, who's a foreigner, who should be excluded. Those are all and it's not just wishy-washy. Do we call, like, how do we call certain population, or how do we call certain policies? Those have real implications for people in terms of whether they qualify for funding, whether they qualify for assistance. And I think that another thing that the Canadian government could see from our Canadian actors can see from our presentations today has been the importance of local actors, local knowledge, and local dynamics. So to not just look at it from the big picture, what's happening in Vietnam or what's happening in Indonesia, but to see what has been also happening locally and what has worked, because there seems to be a broad variety of policies and practices that have, some of them work, some of them not work. Thank you.
Thanks, Isabel. And this is also, it brings in an optimistic note about, that we're going to handle the next global pandemic so much better in this country with all of the experience we have acquired. No, that's false optimism. I'm really sorry about that. Okay, so we do have one last question coming in from an audience member, from Kristen in particular. So I'm going to throw this to you since we still have 4 minutes left, but I'm going to ask you to be very concise, very brief in your response. It is a very interesting question and a broad one as well. When it comes to China particularly, right? Because my previous question was really about, the region in general. But there is quite a lot of debate in this country when it comes to the possibility and in various areas where there could, despite all of the disagreement, especially when it comes to human rights, but also specific issues, thinking about, Hong Kong, thinking about Xinjiang and even Taiwan, where, there is this kind of growing tendency to see the relationship or the lack of relationship that we have with China in explicitly confrontational terms. But the argument is being made also that, there is a rationale for trying to compartmentalize a little bit and having, a recognition that in some cases, collaboration, cooperation is still possible, possibly on some of the issues at least that you have mentioned. Although when it comes to other issues, and I'm thinking about cyber in particular, there might be some points of friction, to say the least. But perhaps in some of the issues that were covered today, there are ways that Canada could think about ways to cooperate with China, but not just, in terms of, again, a state-to-state relationship. And the question was specifically about academics and whether there is a potential for academic collaboration between Canadian academics like yourselves and Chinese academics when it comes to further understanding the issues that you mentioned. So are there areas of potential collaboration, basically, whether that's with China as a state or with other actors? So I'm going to maybe go to Irene for that, if you feel comfortable, Irene.
Sure.
China was kind of a big focus of your remarks.
Yeah, I can take a stab, but also I do have to leave at 3:30, so I guess I have a minute for myself. I mean, I think this is a great question, and I think this is something that I think everyone is grappling with, right? Do you kind of continue to punish China and kind of push them in a corner, or do we engage with them? And I think this question applies for so many different fields, as you've mentioned, but cyber is an obvious one, I suppose. And especially, I think, given the fact that China has been increasing its presence in multiple fora. I mean, the head of the International Telecommunications Union, he's Chinese, he's a former Chinese government official. China has also been, I think, increasing the number of scientists contributing to fora like the IETF, which is like the engineering fora that sets like internet protocols, right? I mean, I think I would be more optimistic here. I think that there should be avenues of collaboration. I think that if anything, maybe that is something that the like-minded countries should do more, engaging with countries, not just China, but also other countries in Southeast Asia and other parts of Asia, because I do think that just as we should be concerned of the China threat, we should also be careful to not conflate all business actors or all academics in China are agents of the state, right? So I think there needs to be balance and nuance there that should be maintained. And I think that how that balance look like and how should that look like moving forward, I think is probably going to vary from sector to sector. And with that, I'm very sorry I have to run, but thank you again.
Thank you so much, Irene, for your contribution today. Thank you so much.
Thank you.
And,
thank you.
Please go ahead and join your meeting. Thank you. I'm going to turn very briefly to Isabel, because you've done, China has been a central focus on your work. You've held appointments in China as well. So I feel like you might have some interesting thoughts on that.
Yeah, well, concluding remarks, let's call them. Sure. So the question was very much targeted to academia, and this has made me reflect a little bit on the ethics proposal that I'm currently working on, because we are looking at risk, right? So we're looking at risk for our Chinese partners, risk for the population who may be interviewing. What would happen to the information collected? How would it be protected? So those are all things that are heightened or even more accentuated in the current context. As for most things, there is no easy, quick answers, unfortunately. But as as Irene was pointing out, I think that it would be a mistake to think that we should avoid all things Chinese, but it is clear that there are more hurdles or more difficulties to make sure that we are protecting our whoever accepts to participate in our studies, that we're making sure that the risk for them, the risk for us, our research assistant, that so all of that is difficult to predict in the current context, but I think it's also it's a challenge that should not be that should be embraced and that should not be avoided.
Thank you so much. That's a great way to conclude our session. We're already 3 minutes over the time limit. That's entirely my fault. So I just want to thank you, our panelists, for joining us today, and thanking the audience as well for making the time and carving out some of their Zoom fatigue for joining us today. So thank you very much. I really enjoyed these discussions. The recording will be available later on via the Defense and Security Foresight Group website if you want to access it or share it. But thank you very much for joining us. This was a great panel. Thanks to our panelists.
Thank you, Stephanie.